Smith on 770 CHQR. Call or text now 974-8255. Out of town toll free 1-800-563-7770. Danielle Smith on 770 CHQR.
Brought to you by the Popowich Carmeli Advisory Group, CIBC Wood Gundy.
Alrighty. Well, I already had one person tell me they're never listening to me again because I allowed John Carpe on my show to talk about the case that he's bringing forward. That is the world in which we live. I just had to respond to them saying, look, I'm a big girl and my audience are grown-ups and they can hear contrary views and they can make their own judgment. And I trust people are able to sift through when they hear BS and dismiss it. And when they hear something credible, they'll work it into their base of knowledge. I really, truly do not understand the objection to why free speech principles that are entrenched in this so-called Chicago principles, why that is causing so much consternation out there. Maybe you guys can enlighten me, because you know what? If you oppose me, I want to hear the reasons why. Now, let me tell you, because this has been rattling around in my head ever since I saw the Global story on it with one of the professors saying, well, you can't allow anti-vaxxers to be able to have some validation of their viewpoint. And so let me tell you what I've done in this show. I had a lot of anti-vaxxers get in touch with me. I'm pro-vaccine. I remain pro-vaccine, even though I have watched The Truth About Vaccines, which is a full documentary series, even though I have had people on the show who are anti-vaccine, even though I even have a file of people sending me anti-vax information. I still remain pro-vaccine. I didn't get my flu shot this year and I got the terrible bout of flu, so I'm not going to ever do that again. But here's what happened by me being willing to listen to that side of the argument. Those who want to draw a link between vaccination and autism, I disagree with that link, but I have done some really interesting segments on autism that came out of that about what really does cause autism. Is it genetics? Is it gut bacteria? Is there are two amazing breakthrough studies that are taking place to change gut bacteria and reduce the symptoms of autism? I don't know that I would have found that if I had gone through and listened to what the anti-vaxxers had to say about that. Also, I saw The Truth About Cancer, which was the same documentary producer. And guess what he found, what he introduced me to? Immunotherapy, using viruses and bacteria in order to treat cancer, something I hadn't ever heard of before. And now we've done a ton of segments on immunotherapy. I could go on a whole variety. I probably have a dozen segments that came out of me wanting to give an honest listen to people that I disagreed with. That to me is the power of why it is you have to listen to the other side. You might be surprised at what they tell you. If they tell you something that's compelling, you think, jeepers, I better go out and get an argument to be able to counter that. And if you're not prepared to do that, then why in the world are you on a university campus in the first place? I should tell you, and I mentioned this to the minister when he sat down, my basic worldview is very much defined by Marxism. And I'll tell you why. Because when I was at school, I learned about the Hegelian dialectic and the Marxist dialectic. And what is that? The whole idea behind it is you take a thesis, it clashes with a counter thesis, there's a synthesis, and then a new thesis emerges. If you hadn't guessed, that's what this show is all about. I bring on people I disagree with all the time. And where did I learn that? I learned it at university. If you stripped out everything that you disagreed with, you might end up thinking about issues in a completely different way, or you might deprive yourself of the ability to think about issues in a different way. So that is my gift to you, friends, is that this is a free speech zone, and we're going to keep it that way. Now, let's hope we can get our university campuses that way, too. I've been a little bit concerned that the minister has announced, because when he came back on, when he was on before, he said, oh yeah, we're going to move forward on this Chicago principles. And it looks like there are some schools that are dragging their feet on it. And it looks like the NDP is making a big issue about this. And so I'm wondering whether or not there's a bunch of pushback going on out there and what the minister's going to do about it. So I thought I'd ask him. Demetrios Nicolaides is Minister for Advanced Education, and he joins me now to talk about it. Minister, thanks for being in again.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so tell me, you've delayed now. You initially wanted to have these principles adopted, I think before they went back to school. Now you're waiting for it to be adopted until December 15th.
Correct.
My interpretation of that is you've got a bunch of schools who don't actually want to do it, so they're dragging their feet. Is that what's going on?
No, that's not the case at all. The reason for the extended deadline is simply due to a lot of logistics. A lot of the boards meet very infrequently and don't meet over the summer. So we recognize that dynamic and wanted to make sure that they had enough time to actually have proper meetings and make sure that faculty representatives and student representatives that constitute the board are able to be in attendance as well at those important discussions.
Okay, maybe you've convinced the schools to go in this direction, but you haven't convinced the NDP. I've been watching David Egan's feed, and I want to get you to comment on a couple of things. You've got Dave Kleiman-Haga writing an article saying the Chicago principles are code for the right of the powerful and privileged to shout down everyone else. Is that what it is? Is that what you're intending with this?
No, absolutely not. The Chicago principles, of course, are intended to help strengthen and promote free speech on campuses. And as well, it's important to note that the Chicago statement goes into a lot of detail talking about a university's right and responsibility in terms of dealing with speech that violates the law. And so the Chicago statements offer that strong balance between ensuring a post-secondary institution recognizes its responsibility in situations where speech may violate the law, but at the same token, ensuring that all ideas can be expressed and discussed in an open and free form. And to the point that you made earlier, that's one of the central purposes and roles of an institution of higher learning is to discuss and debate different ideas.
Okay, so David Egan was the one who retweeted that column out, and he agrees with Dave Kleiman-Haga. It's code for the right of powerful and privileged people to shut down everyone else. He says it is a trophy for right-wingers and social conservatives. Anti-abortion groups want to put their displays into Welcome Week events and do not want to pay for all the security they need when chaos ensues. Shame on the UCP for causing social unrest. I got my own comments on that, but is that? I just want to see how you respond to that, because it does seem to me that David Egan is arguing that Antifa and Black Bloc should be allowed to come on campuses and smash things apart and burn things down and stop speakers that they don't like from speaking, which is what we saw in Berkeley and elsewhere, which is part of the reason why this came through in the first place. And denying them the ability to do that is the powerful and privileged shutting them down. I just think that that's just enforcing social order on both sides.
Oh, absolutely. Nobody has the right, of course, to engage in destructive behavior, and that's not what these principles will create. I know it's regrettable. It's regrettable, but not surprising to hear from the NDP continued campaign of fear and division. I really can't see a situation in which strengthening free speech on campuses can be positioned within the light of fear, but that's apparently what they want to do. And again, more importantly, it's important to note that the Chicago principles, again, do talk at length about the importance and the role of the university, the responsibility of the university to limit the time and place of free speech and of speech events to ensure that they do not disrupt the normal affairs of a university, the normal business of a university. So again, it really strikes that fine balance between ensuring that all ideas can be heard, but at the same time that it's not disruptive or that it does not violate the law.
Okay, I've got you're trying to look for an example of where it could be used in the negative. David Egan to the rescue again. He gives you another example. It says, friendly reminder that Premier Jason Kenney spent his university days bullying women and trying to force them off campus for even mentioning the word abortion. That's what he is asking Alberta Post-Secondary to adopt with the Chicago principles. That's what they're about. It's not free speech. Do you have a response to that one?
Yeah. Again, it's not. It's really regrettable to hear the NDP continuing to position the strengthening of free speech as an avenue to promote hatred and fear. That's not the intent, and they're very clear. The principles are very clear, recognizing, as I mentioned, that free speech cannot violate the law, and more importantly, the legislation that we have in this country and in this province, specifically the Alberta Human Rights Act and the Criminal Code of Canada, make it very clear what that certain types of speech that is intended to be discriminatory or that may be perceived to be discriminatory is against the law and in contravention of the Alberta Human Rights Act. So this, I really don't see this as a way to opening the door to more fear and hate. The only one who's continuing to talk about that, regrettably, is the NDP.
So what are you trying to solve? Because I think there have been pro-life clubs on campus that have not been able to get affirmation of club status. I think that there are also men's groups. I did a segment this morning about a men's conference where they're talking about issues that impact men in particular as well, the injustice in the family law system. There have been, as I think, other examples along those lines. Is that what you're trying to address? Is that a problem here in Alberta?
Yeah, there are a number of very specific examples of an individual's right to communicate their beliefs being suppressed. Case in point, back in, I believe, 2008, if memory serves me correct, a group of students at the University of Calgary were found guilty of non-academic misconduct because they created a Facebook page criticizing a professor and criticizing the quality of that professor. There was another professor, I believe in 2016, at the University of Lethbridge, who was suspended without pay because of comments that individual had made. So there are several more instances.
And then there's Lindsay Shepherd as well, who was chastised by her peers, or I think she was a TA, chastised by other academics because she dared to show a Jordan Peterson presentation in her class and didn't proactively try to dismantle it, tried to let the kids decide what arguments they found persuasive. Correct. And you're seeing that, as I mentioned, several examples here in Alberta, but also across the country, and I would argue even globally. And so it's important, as we mentioned, it's one of the central purposes of a university is to foster free thinking, to help engage in academic debate, and free speech helps strengthen and ensure that core mandate, that core principle of an institution of higher learning is reinforced. Okay, let me pause because there is a school that did manage to post and get in under on the timeline that the minister had suggested. The Keano Board of Governors have affirmed free speech principles. It's a simple 8-point document, which is a bit of a head scratcher for me, why the universities need months and months and months to figure this out. If you're wondering what the principles are, we'll share some of those when we return on 770 CHQR. Got one person saying, do the lefties not realize that the principles apply to everyone, left and right? I think this is important context about where the Chicago principles came from in the first place. And so the minister was telling me a story off the air. I want him to tell it on the air. Minister for Advanced Education, Demetrios Nicolaides, is in studio with me. So Minister, tell us where these came from. Well, that's an interesting point, of course, and it is important to note, of course, that the principles apply to everyone. And when you talk about the Chicago statement, it's just a 2-page document. I'd encourage everybody to read it. But it actually the university implemented the policies and created them in 2014 in response to an invitation to host William Foster, who was the Communist Party's candidate for president, to come and lecture on campus, and that set off a storm of protests and other types of destructive behavior. And so the university decided to do some introspection and realize that, well, we need to be clear about what are the parameters of who can speak and what are the parameters of those who oppose them, and do they have the right to be destructive and to shout down speakers. So it was actually in response to as I mentioned, William Foster, the Communist Party's candidate for president of the United States. So there, it applies to both left and right. Okay, now let me just read through, because that statement of principles is 2 pages. The one from the Keano Board of Governors is very short. It's only got 8 points to it. Number 1, free speech may not violate Canadian law. So that already restricts it. Now, I guess our parameters for free speech are a little narrower than the U.S., aren't they? Correct. Yes, they're much narrower. Within the Canadian Constitution and Criminal Code, free speech is not absolute as it is in the United States. There are much more limitations around speech in Canada already. Okay, so that's number 1. You can't do anything that's going to violate Canadian law. Criminal code still applies. I'm assuming Human Rights Commission and Human Rights Code still apply then too. Yeah, absolutely. The Alberta Human Rights Act has very specific sections and provisions that deal with distribution of material and speech and other types of communication. Okay, so that's number 1. Number 2, institutions are places of free and open inquiry in all matters, and all members of each institution's communities are guaranteed the broadest possible latitude to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn. That's a pretty affirmative statement. Absolutely. It's important to reaffirm that key component, again, of a university and an institution to be a place of discussing different ideas to the broadest latitude of the ideas and the concepts to be discussed. Number 3, community members have the right to criticize and question other views expressed on campus, but cannot obstruct or interfere with others' freedom of speech. As we said already, that's incredibly important, and it's important to be able to offer an alternative viewpoint, to protest, to criticize an individual, but that has to be done, of course, in a manner that doesn't
restrict another individual's ability to listen or participate in a lecture.
Number 4, institutions should not attempt to shield students from ideas or opinions they disagree with or find offensive. Mutual respect and civility are valued, but do not constitute sufficient justification to limit free speech. That one's going to be a challenging one.
It certainly will, but I like the component there again about mutual civility and respect. Again, I think that's particularly important to make sure that we get that balance.
It does also say number 5, this institution may reasonably regulate the time, place, and manner of expression to ensure it does not disrupt the ordinary activities of the institution.
Yeah.
What do you think that they mean by that?
Oh, absolutely. Well, you don't want to get into a situation where you're having a protest or a speaker is invited in a parking lot where it's preventing the normal business of the university in any way.
Got it. Number 6, the institution may restrict expression that violates the law, falsely defames an individual, or constitute a genuine threat or harassment that unjustifiably invades substantial privacy or confidentiality of interest. So they still do have the latitude to say, no, this is just going to cause way too much disruption.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. And again, the important piece there, free speech cannot be a substitute to break the law. And it's important that element is recognized and strengthened as well.
Okay, number 7, debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forward by some are thought to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. That's not going to be sufficient to say, no, we've got to shut this person down.
And that's an important distinction to make. It's and that's what we're seeing a lot of, is that views that are being expressed that are unpopular are being shut down just because individuals may view it to be unpopular. But it's important that those views are still heard.
And last one, it's for individuals, not the institution, to make those judgments for themselves and to act by not seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas they oppose. Oh, that's music to my ears. Holy, that's what it should come down to.
Absolutely. We have to think about, why do I disagree with that individual, and how am I going to position a counter argument, and how am I going to articulate that in defense of the ideas that I have? And so it's important that we conduct that introspection and we think about, how am I going to oppose this individual? What are my own viewpoints, and how am I going to articulate them?
Okay, so Cannon College was able to come up with this. It's very succinct. It makes a lot of sense. It's common sense. I think in some ways you're almost getting a vicious non-compliance. It does still seem to me like this delay is unnecessary if it's that easy to put this together.
Well, it's important for us to, universities are very unique and independent institutions. So my approach and my perspective is recognizing the individual nature and character of a university. They may want to develop their own policies. They may not want to formally adopt the key elements of the Chicago Principle. They do have to conform with the spirit of the Chicago Statement, but they may want to develop their own policy that goes into length talking about, we mentioned the Alberta Human Rights Act and the restrictions there around a speech that is discriminatory. They may want to flesh that out in their own policy. So it's important to give them that flexibility to create their own policies. And furthermore, I know a couple of the universities have talked about the idea of creating an Alberta statement of free expression, working collaboratively together to create a statement that could be rolled out across all institutions, which I think is very innovative. I think is a great idea. And again, it has to conform with the spirit of the Chicago Statement. But I think that's a great initiative.
Okay, we'll make a note to come back in December and see if you have to go for another delay. But I wanted people to see how easy it was for this school up north to be able to do it. Thanks so much for your time today.
Very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
That was Minister for Advanced Education, Demetrios Nicolaides. We were just talking about the Chicago Principles. It's that simple, folks. Let's take a pause. When we get back, we're going to talk to Ken Cobley, President and CEO of the Alberta Chambers of Commerce, to see whether or not they're upset about the Alberta government putting on pause the Alberta investor tax credit. Stay with us on 770 CHQR.